Hello and welcome to our second lecture of week 8. So today is a bit of a two-part lecture. We will be first looking at funerary sculpture, so namely sarcophagi, but also some tombstones. And then after that, we'll transition into a discussion of the Antonine Dynasty, and that is the successors to Hadrian and kind of when it all starts to break down. So we're going to be ending the rule of the 5 good emperors and getting into some more dicey characters. But before we do that, let's look at some sarcophagi. So I kind of want to go over the basics about sarcophagi first. Lots of text on this screen, I know. The word literally means flesh eating. So you used to have a word associated with it that meant stone, and so it's left that we call it as sarcophagi, which means flesh eating because bodies are placed in sarcophagi. Sarcophagi refer to an above ground stone coffin. So the plural is sarcophagi and the singular is sarcophagus. And it's an above ground stone coffin. So that's kind of what categorizes it. It has to be above ground, it has to be stone. And it really began to take off in the Roman world around the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian. And we have some statistics here. So at the beginning of Trajan's reign, 98, about 90% of Romans were cremated and interred in urns. And by the end of Hadrian's reign in 138 CE, so only about, 40 years later, 90% of Romans were laid in sarcophagi. So it completely flipped how many were buried in urns and cremated versus how many were buried in sarcophagi and not cremated. And there's a few reasons for this. One of them is the fact that we see a rise in religious cults which involve a belief in the afterlife. So this includes some that we've already talked about, like Mithras, Dionysus, also the cult of Isis, who was an Egyptian goddess, and then also Hercules, who was a hero who achieves immortality in myth and joins the pantheon and really starts to see a cult develop in this time around Hercules. And so all of these had some kind of belief in the afterlife, more so than a general Roman religion had prior to this. And so because of that, we start seeing people think more about the afterlife and maybe want to preserve their bodies for the reason that they might kind of need them in the next life. But we also see that this is just a time of prosperity. So, Trajan and Hadrian, we see generally somewhat peaceful times and definitely prosperous times. And so Romans begin to have more personal wealth, and that means that they can afford to be buried more lavishly, and they can commission these sarcophagi. And then lastly, we see some influence from Greece and Greek burial practices. Greeks use sarcophagi, and also the types of sculpture that we see looks a little bit Greek. So if you're looking at a sarcophagus, the general form will be a box carved from one piece of marble. It's going to be hollowed out, which is where the body would lie. And then it also has a detached lid that matches onto it. So it's going to be topped by this lid. And it generally has relief sculpture around all of the sides. So that's when it's carved in. We've talked about like low relief, high relief. So it's carved from that same block. And we see 3 main types of reliefs on sarcophagi. The first is mythological, so scenes from myths, scenes of heroes, mythical figures, things like maybe the Aeneid, stuff like that. And then also biographical, so people's life stories would be depicted on their sarcophagus. And you'll see references to events in their life or kind of important things about them. And then the last is children's themes. So we do unfortunately see children's sarcophagi, and these often look a little bit different, both in the size, but also the types of relief images that we see often have to do more with children's themes, and they're different than what might be depicted on an adult's sarcophagus. So we're going to look at examples from each of those 3 categories, and then we'll also look at some other types of funerary sculpture. So to start, we have the Velletri sarcophagus from Velletri, Italy. It's what it's named for. This is from around 135 to 140, so the end of Hadrian's reign. And this is a mythological sarcophagus. This has mythological imagery on it. And you should notice right away that it is quite ornate, it is quite lavish, it's very detailed. We see really high relief, so very, very deep carving, and just lots of very ornate features. And something else that you might notice is that it really resembles a temple. So it's got a pediment here. It has a triangular pediment with some kind of pedimental sculpture. And then it also has these columns on it. And then it also sits on this sort of base, kind of like a stylobate kind of like a temple might have. So we see that a lot, these sarcophagi kind of mimicking temple design. And if you think back way when I think this was maybe in the late Republic or something, I don't remember exactly, but we looked at that sarcophagus that had those Ionic volutes on it that really resembled an Ionic temple. So that's a common thing that we see, and we even see the kind of acroteria on here, very natural imagery as well. It also has kind of, a lot of times sarcophagi will have scenes of revelry as well. So there's kind of a celebration aspect here. And in this case, we see these garlands on top, which kind of mimic garlands that might hang at a banquet. So we're almost decorating this sarcophagus in honor of a celebration. It's almost like the sarcophagus is a banquet or is a party, sort of a celebratory aspect to it. And what we see in the relief sculptures are scenes of Hercules. So scenes from myth, scenes from Hercules and his labors. You can see that there's many, many figures on it. Very crowded scenes. We often see that on sarcophagi as well. They really try to pack it full of figures and of events, or just of decoration in general. So this is the Velletri sarcophagus. We also see other ones with scenes of Hercules. Like I said, the cult of Hercules was getting big at this time, and so it kind of makes sense that with this belief in the afterlife kind of being promoted more from cults like that of Hercules, that these people might put Hercules on their sarcophagi. So that's what we see here. And this is a bit of an interesting one because it features these striated lines. And so we call this a strigulated sarcophagus, strigulated. And we'll see this a lot, kind of this design, these wavy lines. That's what we're referring to right here. And here we also see images of Hercules fighting Cerberus. And Cerberus is that three-headed dog that guards the gate to Hades. So it's a bit of a reference to the underworld, a bit of a reference to the afterlife. The fact that we're including Cerberus on this, kind of hinting at the deceased, their journey into the afterlife. And you can see Hercules is actually right in the center here. And there's two ways that you can always identify Hercules, and that is he's holding a club and he has a lion skin on his head. So it looks kind of like a pelt, and then often it'll have a lion's face kind of right above his face, like he's wearing the pelt. And this refers to one of his labors. So Hercules, a very famous hero in Greek mythology and Roman mythology, and he has to complete 12 labors. And so these 12 labors are these 12 different adventures that he goes on, essentially fighting different monsters. And one of the first ones is the Nemean lion. So that's a place in Greece, Nemea. And he defeats the lion, he kills it, and he takes its pelt and wears it because it's impenetrable. It's like super good armor, the pelt of the lion. And so it's kind of a type of armor that he's wearing, also a sign of his great conquest, though, over this great beast. And because that's one of his earliest labors, you'll see it in many other scenes of Hercules. So that's what we're seeing here. He's got the lion skin and he holds a club, and then the three-headed dog is right below him. And they're almost peeking out from behind a door. So it's almost like maybe that's some kind of door to the underworld. So definitely references to the underworld, to the afterlife. You often see that on sarcophagi. And if we look also at the top, we see again these garlands, which are kind of like banquet type garlands, kind of celebratory, and you see these little putti kind of figures who are holding them up, kind of being playful. So we see an interesting mix, right? Because we see kind of celebration on the top, maybe a celebration in honor of this person's life, and then we see a reference to the underworld on the lower register, along with these strigulated lines. What we see here is another scene from myth, and just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the whole story, but what we see is a battle scene, and this is a very dramatic, very crowded battle scene. And so that's kind of the point of this one, is just to show you how dramatic these can get, how expressive they can get. There's so much movement, so much dynamism. We see these figures, ones who have already been slain, very dramatically laying on the floor. We see this one in this crazy body position with their head on the ground and their legs up in the air. This person just who can't bear to look at it. We see other people here with these expressions on their faces, very mournful or dramatic expressions. And then this one with his sword about to slice So we see just a lot of movement, a lot of expression, and really they're doing the best they can to fill this space. They really want to fill it and jam pack it with as much sculpture as they can. So this is the Melee sarcophagus, and we can see that it is named for its central hero. So this is Melee here, and he is holding a giant stick, a giant spear, and with that spear, he is stabbing this giant boar off to the side, which is rendered in pretty good detail. And this one also is just jam-packed with figures, both in this scene and then also the register above with the smaller figures. We are really taking up all the space that we can in sort of a horror vacui type thing. Horror vacui is an artistic term that meets French, and it essentially means like fear of open space, that you're afraid of open space, and not in the literal sense of being afraid, but just the sense that artists want to fill every single nook and cranny that they can. They don't want any open wall. So we kind of see that represented here. And as I said, there's our central hero stabbing the boar. This is a hero from myth. And what we're seeing is the height of the action of the story, where he's in the climax, right when he's going to stab the boar that he's been fighting. It's kind of the most exciting moment. And so that's the moment that we're going to depict here, is the climax of the action. We also see other animals represented here. So we see some dogs below as well, and other men who hold weapons. And so this is sort of all representing a hunting party. So the men are fellow hunters, and then they have their hunting dogs with them and their weapons. And there's a couple reasons that this could be depicted on a sarcophagus. The first is that perhaps the man who is buried in this sarcophagus is he wants to be depicted, or his family, whoever commissioned this, because sometimes they were commissioned within a person's lifetime, so they kind of got to choose, and other times it was a family commissioning it for them. But perhaps this man wants to be depicted or remembered as a strong, manly man who goes out and is courageous and hunts. And so we're going to depict other heroes here. We're going to depict other strong men as kind of a reference to the strong man who lies in repose in this sarcophagus. So it could be a reference to that. Also could reference the conquest of death, kind of the conquering of death, that this scene that we're seeing, Meleager killing this boar, was seen to be an impossible task. It was kind of like a Herculean type labor, and so a huge task, and the fact that they can achieve it is sort of achieving the impossible. So maybe there's an idea of success, of victory here, of the fact that you could also be victorious over death, or that you could be triumphant, strong in the afterlife too. So we see a lot of different kind of meanings that are imbued within this scene. Definitely a lot of action though, as well as in the frieze above it. So very intricate, lots of detailing, lots going on here. We're going to move now to biographical sarcophagi. So this one is the Portonacchio sarcophagus, also named for its place. This is from a little bit later, about 180 to 190, somewhere around there. And what we are seeing here is a very elaborate, very crowded battle scene. So similar to what we've seen on other ones, definitely horror vacui represented here too. There's almost no open space. They have filled every nook and cranny with some kind of person or weapon or something. We see also kind of the hallmarks of Roman battle scenes. So we see the battle itself taking place, and then on the sides we see barbarian captives in their kind of traditional pose with their hands bound. We see them wearing pants over here, kind of hard to see. We also see shields, Roman shields, and other weapon type imagery in this scene. And so, and if we look really closely, it's hard to see, I know, but you can just make out that there is this figure in the center. There's a man who's actually a little bit bigger than those around him. So if you compare this figure to maybe the men down here, he's a little bit larger. So we see some hierarchical scale here, which is the idea of the more important people are going to be depicted larger. And if you look really closely, you can see that his face is actually uncarved. So there's no detailing to his face, like where his facial features should be. It's just kind of rough, unfinished stone. So that is going to be the man who was buried in this sarcophagus. And there's a couple of reasons why they might do that. It might be that he had died and then they are creating this sarcophagus afterward, and so they don't know what he looks like. They don't have a photograph of him, right? Because no photographs existed back then. So they might not know what he looked like, and so they just left it blank. But it's also possible that even though this is a biographical sarcophagus, it's possible that this was made kind of generally. It was made by, artisans, made by sculptors, just to represent scenes that were kind of common to a lot of people's lives. Because what we see is, so we see a battle scene, and we see that man with the unfinished face right here. We see that he's probably a general, and you can tell also that he's the focus of the scene because there's these lines pointing to him. So this line up here, this kind of sword, I suppose, is pointing to him. And then there's also these lines here. So there's like all of these lines that kind of lead up to him. And even this one is sort of pointing to him. So we see all of these kinds of X's, like 1, 2, 3, 4, all circling around him. So that's how we also know he's the main guy. But we see that he's a general and he's in battle, and we've talked before about how the military was a very common part of a Roman man's life. A lot of Roman men served in the military. So this could have been a common scene that kind of applied to anyone's life. And then up top, what we see in that, on the lid, in that frieze at the top, we see a birth scene and a wedding scene and a scene of clemency, which is sort of pardoning someone. So that's kind of in order here, from birth to wedding to clemency. And so again, those are kind of maybe common scenes, everyone's born, or if you had a child, maybe it's depicting that. Most men got married, and so we see a wedding scene, and then the clemency scene could maybe kind of relate back to the idea of a man being general, and so he's granting pardon to an enemy, another type of kind of military reference here. So these are all the important scenes in a standard Roman man's life, both personally and professionally. And so there are definitely instances, and most instances, sarcophagi would be made specifically for a person. So I don't want to confuse that most of them were made for a specific person, that they were an individualized representation of someone's life. The person would have their face carved, all of that. It might even look like them, very individualized, events specific to their life. But with this one, with the unfinished face, it's possible that it was more of a general one. Something else just kind of cool to notice is these protomes on the side. So these heads, these sculpted heads, which form the corners of the sarcophagus. Kind of interesting, these human heads, maybe representing gods or something of that sort, because they are also bigger in size. So this is our biographical one, representing scenes from the man's life, birth, wedding, battle, or his career. And then of course also implied in that life story is his also death, because this is a sarcophagus. So the sarcophagus itself, the man inside the sarcophagus, is sort of completing this cycle of birth, wedding, career, and then death. The third theme that we had was children's themes. And so, as I said, unfortunately, we do see many children's sarcophagi. We know that they're children's sarcophagi because they're smaller in size. So they are shaped to fit a child's body rather than an adult-sized body. And this one that we see here, the front panel from a child's sarcophagus, you can also refer to it as the University of Missouri sarcophagus or something. That's usually why we put the museum name, in case it has a very general name. You can refer to it by the museum's name. So what we see here is similar stylistically to these other sarcophagi that we have looked at. This vibrant use of space, very dynamic, lots of movement going on, lots of action going on. But we don't see a battle scene. What we actually see is a scene at a hippodrome. And if you remember from last time, we talked about a hippodrome is like a stadium specifically for horse racing. So that's what we see. We see horses here being driven by these putti in chariots, these kind of cherubs, Cupid-like figures, like right here and right here, you can see their wings, which was kind of associated with childhood because they are children, that's how they're depicted. So they're in these chariots and they're being pulled by horses, and we can see because there's an obelisk here, and that always stood in the center. There was always kind of a row of sculptural elements or monuments in the center of the stadium or the hippodrome, marking the inside of the track. back. So you're gonna make loops around this central strip of monuments, and an obelisk was a very common one, and we kind of see a couple of other types of structures here. And so the ones in the front, the little cherubs and their chariots in the front are going one way, and then you can almost trace it as they go back around the other way. So it's like a circle, even though we're on a flat panel of marble. So you can see that they're making this loop, and then that obelisk is going to be in the middle, just like it would be in a stadium. So we are not seeing battle scenes here, but we are seeing more recreation, more games, right? Kind of leisure activities, things that, you know, children might have attended. It seems a little bit more appropriate for a child's life to put kind of games on there and not something as serious as a battle scene, because the child wouldn't have participated in that. We also think that this could be specifically the Circus Maximus, kind of because of that obelisk. Also, it could be referencing a specific stadium. And then also, that was kind of specific to this one, but in other child's sarcophagi, sometimes we do see battle scenes actually, and we see scenes that are kind of biographical, but showing events that didn't happen. So it's almost like a continuation of the child's life, that we're going to depict what happened, even though it didn't actually happen, as sort of a sign of kind of a life cut too short. But other times they are much more playful, like we see here, appropriate for a child. So we're going to move now to looking at a lid of a sarcophagus. So the ones that we were looking at before, those are all the side reliefs of sarcophagi, but the lids would often be quite sculptural or decorated as well. And this one should look a little bit familiar to you. So it kind of resembles the sarcophagus of the spouses from the Etruscan sarcophagi that we looked at in the very, like, the first class or so. And so what we see is a man and a woman. They are reclining. Their bodies are along the length of the sarcophagus lid, and they are looking at one another. But there are some things going on here that are not so typical of just a normal husband and wife hanging out on a couch. So a couple things that we see that the man is the man is bare-chested. He's holding a long reed, so you can see that here. There's sort of a reed sticking out right there. And this looks like it might be a sort of lizard creature. You can see the little like lizard paws, kind of like gecko paws, and it's kind of creeping up from underneath him. And then the woman, she is wearing a very flowy garment, very classical in style, and she is holding 2 sheaves of wheat right here, and then a garland as well. And her sort of accompanying creature that she has is a more furry animal. You can tell by this furry tail. I thought this was the lizard at first, and no, then you see the tail. So they're not super great at maybe sculpting animals here. So we see some furry animal, and it maybe has some kind of figure on its back, maybe like a Cupid or an Eros figure on its back. So what's this representing? Well, this is a representation of the water and the earth. So the woman is kind of in the guise of Tellus, the earth goddess. So she's holding that wheat, and she has a creature of the land with her, a land animal, a mammal with her. And then the man is holding a reed, which is sort of, you know, like if you think of the Nile, reeds from the Nile or something. And he has a more lizardy kind of creature, which might go in the water as well, might be more associated with the water. So they are kind of these semi-divine personifications of water and of earth. And they're similar to some that we've seen of river gods almost. If you think of like the river god that was on the column of Trajan in a way, he looks a little bit similar to that. So this is a couple who would be buried in the sarcophagi together, in the sarcophagus together. But they are being depicted as almost semi-divine. And if you'll notice also the woman's face, just like our man was on the biographical sarcophagus, her face is unfinished. So that is probably representing that the man predeceased her, and so the man probably died first, and so she was able to commission it and get his portrait done, but perhaps she died and there was no one really taking the responsibility. There was no one who stepped up to get her face carved as well, because that would usually have to be done by the members of the family. So maybe they didn't have any other family members who could do that after she died. So she was able to do that for her husband, but unfortunately no one was able to do that for her. So this is a common kind of iconography that we see, and as I said, a reference or a holdover from the days of the Etruscans. So I think that's going to do it for sarcophagi, but I do want to look at a couple other types of funerary sculpture, and that is tombstones. So these would not have been associated with sarcophagi. They would have been a bit simpler, maybe for people who were buried or who were cremated. We also often see these tombstones associated with military figures. So actually none of these are military figures, but a lot of times they are related to soldiers. They are tombstones for soldiers, and we do find them in the provinces, and that might be because someone dies while they're on a military campaign, and so they're not shipped back to Rome when they don't have a sarcophagus, or maybe they can't afford it if they are just a soldier, and so they get a tombstone set up in the provinces. So some things that we see here, they all have inscriptions. So they all have epigraphs, and these epigraphs kind of talk about their life, talk about who they are, and they always often mention the person who created the tombstone, who financed it, or who put in the effort to put it up. So it will say something like this tombstone is dedicated to Titus Aurelius Saturnius, and it was constructed by his brother, so and so, so and so, and so it always kind of attributes the construction to someone. But these do also have scenes, and they are often individualized scenes, and so we see portraits of the deceased on them. Here we have a 6-year-old boy, and so we have his likeness there. And then here we have 2 women, and we're not sure exactly what the relationship is between these women, because the inscription says something about a man setting it up for his wife, and that the wife is one of the women. And then we don't know who the other woman is, so we don't know if it's a sister, if it's a relative of some sort, maybe someone else who she was close to. We don't know. But some differences, just some different kind of variations in the types of tombstones that we can see. And this one is actually kind of a fun one. So this one, we're not sure if it's a literal tombstone or sort of a joke tombstone, if it's real or not. But this is the pig stele of Edessa from the 2nd or 3rd century, and it commemorates a pig that was killed, and so it has this poem on it. So that's maybe it's sort of a poet just being funny. We're not sure if it's literal or not. But it talks about a pig, friend to everybody, which I love. A pig who was friend to everybody, and it talks about how the pig made this journey, but left behind the land of Dalmatia and crossed over the earth on foot alone, unscathed. But then, by the force of a wheel, it was killed, unfortunately, and so it was essentially run over in a chariot accident. It was in a kind of accident and got run over. So quite sad, and someone, if this is real, mourned the loss of this pig and put up this stele for them. And so we see, we're not sure if it's literal or not, but kind of cute. And you have a great depiction of the poor piggy being run over by the chariot, and then you have the poem around it. So I wanted to leave on a little bit lighthearted note, but still sad if you're a fan of pigs. We are going to move now to the Antonine Dynasty, so that's going to do it for our funerary sculpture. And we will talk more about funerary sculpture as this goes on, because as I said, it kind of grows under Trajan and Hadrian. And so then we start to see it, in all of the reigns after them. So we'll look at a few more as the class goes on, but that's kind of our primer on it. So the Antonines, these were the successors to Hadrian. So Hadrian dies in 138, and he, like those before him, names his successor, and his successor takes over in 138, and it is Antoninus Pius. So as Nerva and Trajan did, Hadrian also adopts someone. He adopts someone who he thinks is going to be the best for the job. So this is the 4th of the 5 good emperors, and he is chosen also on merit. He will also, though, form kind of the transition period into the Antonines. So we have the 5 good emperors, and they really overlap with the Antonine dynasty. So Antoninus Pius, and that's where we get the name of the dynasty, is from his first name. He was a little bit different from Hadrian, though, in that he was not a fan of travel. So where Hadrian went all over the empire and built things all over the place, Antoninus Pius just wanted to stay at home. He ruled from a villa outside Rome, his imperial villa, and we have lots of letters from him because that was kind of how he ruled. He ruled through letter writing, sending letters throughout the empire for his decrees. So not as exciting maybe as Hadrian, and we don't have as vast of artwork or architecture under Antoninus Pius. He's also notable because he adopted 2 successors. So he's going to choose 2 men to succeed him, and they're going to rule jointly, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But this is sort of where we start to see a breakdown a little bit, because he's going to pick people who are related to him. And that's going to, that's always a shaky idea. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But Antoninus Pius, if we look at his bust here, you should notice that he is bearded. And so this becomes the trend after Hadrian. The emperors start adopting beards in their portraiture and probably in their real lives as well. And so we see this trend kind of take off. Something else that you might notice that we have mentioned before, but not in marble sculpture, is the sculpting of pupils. So whereas typically before this, marble sculpture would have just flat eyes and then you would paint on the pupils, we actually start to see them being sculpted. So if you look really closely, you can see that definition. You can see his pupils being sculpted to look a little bit more lifelike. And we also see, that's right, going back to the idea of the beard, it wasn't just to emulate Hadrian, but it was also because we start to see this sort of Greek revival under multiple emperors. So Hadrian, also, as we've talked about a lot, was a big fan of Greece, but we also see Antoninus taking an interest in sophists, which are an ancient philosophical group, and kind of an interest in Greek writing and oration, and kind of public speaking. So Antoninus kind of favored this ability to speak on the fly, to kind of be fancy with words. So maybe that's why also he was not a fan of travel. He was a little bit more of an intellectual, wanted to stay at home and study than go out and travel. But stylistically, this sculpture looks pretty conservative, so it's pretty classicized. It's not anything too wild or crazy. It's kind of just a standard portrait, and that kind of sums up who Antoninus was. He was kind of just a simple conservative guy, so nothing too wild. One of the things that he does have built is the Temple to Hadrian, or the Hadrianeum. So that ending again, that eum ending is kind of, that is the Latin, and then the aeon ending, those always denote temples. That's kind of the ending for a temple. So this is the Temple to Hadrian. It's in the Campus Martius in Rome. After Hadrian's death, Antoninus Pius has him deified, and so then he builds a temple to him in the city of Rome. Not okay to do during the person's reign, but once they've died, you can erect it in the city of Rome. It's kind of partially destroyed, as you can see. So the colonnade is what we're looking at, that is Roman, these Corinthian columns here, and then it's built into, I don't think it's a modern building. I think it might be a Renaissance building, or probably Baroque. I don't know, some kind of later building. And it actually today is the home to Rome's Chamber of Commerce. So it is still a functional building, and you can see where the Roman ruins are versus the later buildings, and then it's still in use today as the Chamber of Commerce. So kind of interesting. What we do see are some reliefs that came from it, and these reliefs are no longer in situ. And I'm not sure if we've talked about that term before. Very important to use if you want to sound like an art historian or an archaeologist. In situ. So in situ means in place or in position. And when we say things are either in situ or not in situ, we're referring to where they are now. So if something is in situ, you could say, that the sarcophagus, for instance, the sarcophagus is in situ, then that would be it's in its original place. It has never been moved. That's exactly where it was at its time of origin. It was placed in that spot, and it is still in situ. It is still there. When things are no longer in situ, this means they have been removed from their place of origin and are now elsewhere, oftentimes in a museum. So that's what we see here. These are reliefs from the Temple of Hadrian, but they are no longer in situ. They are now in the Capitoline Museum. So, as I said, a good word if you want to sound like an art historian. These reliefs are reliefs of captives, and we've kind of seen a lot of this imagery before, but these are very specialized in the sense that we see specific traits that point to their nationality or their culture, where they're from. So we see captives who are from across the empire here. Hadrian was an emperor of the provinces, and so we kind of see a representation of that a little bit here in the depiction of captives. And you can see that's kind of funny. We have a Parthian here who has bows and arrows, and his hat has gotten squished because he's being forced to fit in this square space. And so that normal kind of seven dwarves type cap has been squished by the top to make it fit. So kind of funny. And then you can see also, right, because he's wearing pants. So we know that he's a Parthian. And you can see that this guy over here is wearing pants as well. And so signs of barbarians. So that's going to do it for Antoninus Pius. As I said, not a super exciting guy, kind of an intellectual who just liked to stay home. But after him, we have the last of the 5 good emperors. And this is actually, so we have this dual rule, as I said, that his 2 successors that he adopted. Marcus Aurelius was his nephew. And Lucius Verus was actually kind of had an interesting story. So he was actually Hadrian's first adopted heir. But when he was adopted quite young, and then his biological father dies, and so he needs an actual guardian. And so Antoninus Pius takes over as his guardian, as his adopted father, in a more kind of familial way. So when Hadrian dies, or right before, when he decides to pick someone, he decides to pick Lucius Verus's adopted father. It's kind of confusing. Antoninus Pius. So that is why we have this co-rule here, because Lucius Verus was kind of supposed to be emperor, and so we still have him. But we also want to pick Marcus Aurelius, who is the nephew of Antoninus Pius. So there's a little bit of nepotism. So what they work out is having a rule of 2 that only lasts for about 8 years, because Lucius Verus ends up dying in 169. And so then we just have Marcus Aurelius. So because of that, Lucius Verus isn't really counted as one of the 5 good emperors. He didn't really make an impact, I guess. And Marcus Aurelius is more the guy who we count as that spot. This dual rule was called the Concordia Augustorum, which means the harmony of the Augusti, who are emperors, right? So a harmony of the emperors, kind of a way of making it sound good. Everything's peaceful here, don't worry. If we look at their portraits briefly, we see that both are bearded. So they both have beards, continuing that tradition that started under Hadrian. With Marcus Aurelius, we see these really deep, sunken, hooded eyes. He almost looks a little bit sad. He kind of looks a little bit depressed. That's, his facial features here. His mouth is a little bit downturned, and these, as I said, these kind of hooded eyes makes him look a little bit sad. Lucius Verus has this crazy hair. He has this really curly hair, and so that's what we're seeing with him. But not going to talk much about Lucius Verus. I'm going to focus more on Marcus Aurelius because he had a much longer reign. So we're going to look at a few more portraits. We're going to look at some female portraits. The first is Faustina the Elder. She is the wife of Antoninus Pius, and this is from around 140 to 160. And what we see here is a over life-size statue, which combines a kind of conventional portrait head with a somewhat standardized body type. And this is this body type, this type of the body sculpture, is referred to as the large Herculaneum woman style. And this is because it bears similarities to the large Herculaneum woman, which is a statue that was found at Herculaneum from much earlier, so 40 to 60 CE, so about 100 years before. And in both, we see the same kind of pose. So there's this sort of standardized pose that you can get on your sculpture. And it's really remarkable if you look at the 2 of them. They're really the similarities in the garments, the way that the garments are rendered, the positioning of the garments, the fact that we have a sort of underneath garment that you can see poking out at the bottom. It is really striated, has this almost fluting to it. Very vertical, these deep lines. And then there's this overcoat in a way, this overgarment, which is draped kind of complexly in a way. There's a complexity to it. So we see folds that are going different directions, and then we see them pulling at one garment. They're almost holding on to that one garment as it wraps around their shoulder and then down to their arm. And then it is all capped off by this veil. And they're even looking the same direction, and they both kind of have this almost pensive gaze to them. And this type of statue kind of became common for matrons. So for a little bit older of woman, a woman who's married and probably has children, this was a common style. And we also see that they are kind of also, because of that veil that we've talked about, right, depicting some kind of piety, some sort of piousness, in that they might not necessarily be priestesses, but they are pious women, and they are sort of referencing their devotion to the gods. We see that also Faustina the Elder and Antoninus Pius had a pretty good marriage. They seemed to care for one another. When she dies in 141, Antoninus Pius does not remarry, and he actually declares her divine and builds a temple in her honor in the Roman Forum. So, relationship goals get you a man who will build you a temple in the Roman Forum. And declare you a goddess. And they do also have a daughter. So this is their daughter, Faustina the Younger, named after her mother. So she's the daughter of Faustina the Elder and Antoninus Pius, and she ends up marrying her first cousin, Marcus Aurelius. So she also becomes empress after. This portrait of her, she looks a little bit younger here, so she's not as much in that matron pose or that matron style. She looks younger, and she looks a little bit fashionable. She has this kind of cool hairstyle with these curls that are kind of maybe pinned or pinned back or something. She also looks quite idealized. So she looks quite young, she is idealized, but we do see that over the course of her lifetime, she does age. So she's not frozen in time like we've seen some public figures. Her portraits do show her age. And we also see in this hairstyle, there's also a bun in the back that you can't tell from here. And we see that Roman women like their buns, so not much has changed. This also, we see a drilling of the eyes. So we see her pupils carved out. And we also see a similarity in the Fayum portrait that we looked at. So if you remember, this was it was a Fayum portrait of an Antonine woman, and I told you would find out later what Antonine was. And so that's why she's named this, is because she looks like she is part of the Antonine styles. And so she has a very similar a curled hairstyle in the way that these curls kind of frame her forehead and then maybe are even pulled back. So another example of how imperial styles on women's haircuts and also men's, because we talked a little bit about beards also, but how these make their way down through society and sort of become the trends for all women or all people. So we see some similarities here. We are going to focus on Marcus Aurelius. So he's kind of a famous emperor as they go. He was a philosopher emperor. So similar to how I said that Antoninus Pius was an intellectual, he liked to read and he really was interested in Greek philosophy. Marcus Aurelius was the same way in the fact that he also, he wrote in Greek, but he was a fan, whereas Antoninus Pius was a fan of the Sophist movement. He was a fan of Stoicism. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But just to continue, so Marcus Aurelius also is the last of the 5 good emperors because the peace of Rome, this Pax Romana, really starts to break down under him. So he spends a lot of his reign on the battlefield. He's out on the borders. He's actually there himself. He's not staying at home like his predecessor. He's out fighting, though. He's not like Hadrian either, who traveled a lot, but just kind of was on tour. Marcus Aurelius does have to fight. He is fighting foreign enemies along the border. And this is sort of the beginning of the end of this Roman peace that we've seen. So Marcus Aurelius, a bit of a mix because he's a philosopher emperor, but he's also a military general. So yes, what do we see about Stoicism? So Stoicism was an ancient Greek philosophy, and it focused on a couple of things, which were virtue and logic. And it was a lot of introspection about whether or not you did the right thing, a lot of reflection on always trying to be good, always trying to do the right thing, always trying to have the highest virtue. Marcus Aurelius wrote a lot about this, and we have his writings. He wrote the equivalent of a book, although we think they were probably just personal writings, but he writes a lot about philosophy. And so a lot of what we know about Stoicism comes from his writings. But some of the things that he says are, don't surrender to enemies, don't weep at funerals, and that fear should not guide your actions, only virtue. And you can't control other people's actions, but you can control your own response to them. So he would make a great therapist, I think, except maybe, you probably cry at funerals if you want to. But, he's all about, to try to do the right thing, just do your best. You can't control others, but you can control your own actions. So he really was an introspective guy. And we see that, we already looked at his first portrait where I said he maybe looks a little bit sad, but it's possible that he was just deep in thought. He was kind of thinking more introspectively, thinking about how to be a good person. So this inner life kind of comes out in his portraiture. If we look at one of his most famous sculptures that we see, the Equestrian Statue of him, his face is the same way. So he's in the equestrian style, he's horseback, and he's kind of in this orator pose where he looks like he's maybe addressing some troops. but his face is still very calm. Still, almost his mouth is a little bit downturned. He has those same kind of hooded, sunken eyes. And so he looks very stoic, right? That's where that name comes from, is that don't show emotion. He looks very, very calm and very, maybe there's a lot going on the inside, but not on the outside. We don't project that. So a very calm face. And even same thing in this colossal statue. So this one's a little bit different because we again see the differences between the metropole and the provinces. So we see the creative liberties that they take in the provinces, the ways that they kind of deviate from the norm, from the accepted style of imperial portraiture. And so we see him have a little bit more rounded cheeks, these bigger full lips, and his eyes are looking upwards. And usually when eyes are looking upwards, that's a sign of piety. That you're sort of directing your eyes toward the heavens, which is where the gods reside. So we see similarities in his haircut and in his beard here, but a little bit different facial features. So a little bit of, as I said, deviation from the norm in the provinces. If we look a little bit closer at the equestrian statue, though, so we can just compare it to the equestrian statue of Domitian / Nerva, and just to kind of hammer that point home again, the idea of a calmness in Marcus Aurelius's face, that it's about introspection, it's about your inner life, that you don't show emotion. We see Nerva's face here, I guess, looking kind of stern, like he's in battle. His arms also raised, more like he's fighting, and his horse is much more kind of chaotic, or there's a lot more action going on. Its mouth is open and it's sort of, flayed. But Marcus Aurelius, we see a lot more calmness, and he sort of seems to be more in control. So we see a calmness, a very stoicism in Marcus Aurelius. As I said, this is a very famous sculpture. So the original is today in the Capitoline Museum, and it's in kind of this impressive space. But it would have originally stood outside on the Capitoline Hill. The medieval people took a big interest in it because they actually thought it was a depiction of Constantine, who was a later emperor who they were a big fan of. So they thought it was Constantine, and so they were kind of putting this sculpture up in a prominent location. Turns out it was not. It's Marcus Aurelius, definitely. But to honor that kind of position, they have made a replica and put that one in the same spot on the Capitoline Hill, and then we've moved the original inside for safety. But you can go see it today if you'd like. So moving on to the reign of Marcus Aurelius and some works of art that we see. So this is on the column of Antoninus Pius, and you'll see that it was in 161, so that's the first year of Marcus Aurelius's reign. And so similar to how we see arches put up in people's honor, this was kind of the same thing. This was a column put up in Antoninus Pius's honor. There wasn't any relief sculpture on the column, we think, but we do have the pedestal of it, which does have a lot of relief sculpture, and maybe makes sense because that's what you can see best, right? And we learned from Trajan's column, it's kind of hard to see up above what's going on. So this is in a very classicizing style in a way, but it also mixes. So we have some classical elements, but then we also start to see some changes. So this is interesting because this is sort of going to be a prelude in a way to late antique art and what we're going to get into later, but it's still fairly classical. It's just starting to hint at some changes. So let's look a little bit closer. So this is the Apotheosis of Antoninus Pius and Faustina. So we know that this is again built after his death because it was commissioned by Marcus Aurelius to be in honor of him, to be in honor of the fact that he is now a god and he is now ascending into heaven or into the heavens as a member of the pantheon. So it looks pretty classical. This is fairly Greek in style. The way that the drapery is rendered, the sort of elegant, serene calmness that we have here, especially in this central figure, and that we see some movement because we see these wings, and so we see a sense of movement upward, and we also see the way that these garments are flowing. It's almost like wind is going through them. So it is dynamic, but it's also calm. You don't feel like this is a scene of action. You almost feel like that central figure is kind of just floating. We're all very calm here. And so there's certain elegance that is sort of associated with the classical period. And then we also, if we look at the body proportions and the bodies, they are the proportions of classical art, of classical sculpture. So there's an attention to naturalism here. And they are also idealized. So we see that the central figure, again, is very muscular, is youthful, looks athletic, is sort of that male hero. And you can see that he has a fig leaf on, which was not original, I can assure you. What else do we see? So the main central figure is a kind of personification, I guess, of eternity. So he's supposed to represent the eternal nature that Antoninus Pius and Faustina now hold, that they are now eternal, now immortal, right? So he's a personification of that, and he is holding the globe with a snake on it. So he's kind of holding the world in a way. And then we see Antoninus Pius and Faustina kind of on his back, like he's almost like a chariot. And so he is carrying them into heaven. And then we see also two eagles on either side of them as personifications of the Roman state. They're imperial eagles, symbols of Rome. And then at the bottom, we see two more personifications. So we see an actual personification of Roma, whereas the eagles are kind of symbols of Rome. We see Roma, who is actually personification of Rome, this woman. She's dressed in that battle armor or the battle helmet. She has a shield. And if you remember from the Apotheosis, she looks very similar to that. And then on the other side, we have this man who is a personification of the Campus Martius. And he has his left hand on an obelisk. And we do know that Antoninus Pius built things in the Campus Martius, so maybe that's sort of a reference to his accomplishments, since we know he wasn't super present in the rest of the empire. It's a reference to his grounding in Rome and the emphasis that he had on Rome with Roma and the Campus Martius and that obelisk, which is also something that would have probably been in the Campus Martius. So that is what we see here, a very kind of classical scene. But if we go to the other side, we see something a bit different. And so this is the Decursio Equitum. And this is a depiction of a sort of funeral rite in which if you were a military general and you would be buried on a funeral pyre, prior to that, soldiers would ride in a circle around the funeral pyre before it was lit. And we've talked about this sort of symbolism of circling a tomb or something, or a funeral pyre, as a sort of way of paying homage, of showing reverence to the deceased. And so that's what we see here in the fact that they're in this circle, and then there's that central scene where we have foot soldiers. So those are all paying homage to the emperor, and this is sort of a recorded ritual that we have. We have a text that talks about it after Augustus's death, and talks about how they do this, and then the body is laid on the funeral pyre, and then in Augustus's case, as the body was being burned, an eagle was released in a way, or came out from the pyre and ascended into heaven as his apotheosis. So not sure if that happened at Antoninus Pius's funeral, but we see a depiction of that right here, and so it's sort of a way of paying reverence to him again. But we see a little bit different style from the one that we just looked at, the apotheosis scene. That was very classical, very serene, and what we see here is a bit more abstracted. So we see a bit more of static movement here. We see that everyone has their own ground line, and it's actually based more on what you'd see in non-elite art. So classical art was kind of the art of the upper class, whereas non-elite art was a little bit more abstract, a little bit more simplistic, like this is. These sort of rigid figures, not a lot of individuality on each one. But sort of the same figure being mimicked over and over in a way. So kind of an interesting duality that we have here. As I said, multiple ground lines. So instead of things like the Arch of Titus, which we saw earlier, where it was one ground line and it was a single moment in the parade, what we are seeing is multiple ground lines in space. So we're seeing kind of like on that sarcophagus, of the child sarcophagus, where it showed both sides of the stadium. We're almost seeing that here in a sense that it's showing kind of the whole scene, but it's hard to render. And so it's done a bit odd because it looks like the people on top are above the other ones, but they're supposed to kind of be behind them. So that's what I mean when I say it's more abstracted, in that it's not as realistic. It doesn't really make as much sense. It's much more kind of unrealistic in terms of how something actually works in the real world. The depth isn't portrayed correctly. Where we see depth in the Arch of Titus, we see those two lines of soldiers, and some are in higher relief and some are in lower. Here we see them all in higher relief, but in different spots on the panel to make it seem like there is depth. So a little bit of a different style here. As I said, we see much more naturalistic classical art on the left and a bit more abstract and perhaps non-elite art on the right. And I'm not really sure exactly why this is, but we do see this abstract type art more moving forward. So we see a little bit of a change toward that. So it might also be because, as I've said, less prosperity. And so if we are having to defend the empire, we can't spend as many resources on art. So perhaps we have to commission, kind of non-elite artists and a bit simpler styles. So it could be something like that. Another work of art, we have the column of Marcus Aurelius. So this is a little bit later in 180, and it's a bit similar to Trajan's column. So it has a lot of similarities in the fact that it is a spiraling frieze. So it is one single scene and it's spiraling all the way up. It's not quite as tall as Trajan's column, but it's still pretty impressive. It is also not as classical as Trajan's, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But it's you can notice here that there are the reliefs like we have on Trajan's column, and we also again have these multiple ground lines. So ground lines are always like where people are standing on the ground, right? So that's how that was, where you see like this is people's, the ground should be right here, the ground should be right here, and the ground should be right there, and you can actually see a little bit of the ground. So the same thing is happening here, where in each register we have multiple ground lines, or in a lot of them we do. And this column, a little bit unlike Trajan's, because in Trajan's we see many different scenes. We see battle scenes for sure. We see the scene of ad locutio addressing the troops. We see building scenes and we see captive scenes, but it is all done in a somewhat classical style. And so while there's action, the action isn't like Hellenistic action. It's not over the top, super dramatic action. It's kind of more graceful action in a way. And this we see being much more dramatic, much more expressive, and honestly much more graphic. So this is a destruction scene of a village. So we have Roman soldiers coming into a village, and we see a woman getting abducted, like he's grabbing her hair and going to abduct her. We see this person with that facial expression that is really, really dramatic. His face is like in a grimace, and he's about to like hit the person who was already down. And so we see lots of action here, and we see a bit sadder of scenes where we saw captives on Trajan's column, but here we see them, it's a bit sadder, I think, just the actual act of being captured and the actual act of this man being killed. And then we also see a man underneath here. So definitely a scene of referencing the trials and tribulations that the Roman army is going through on the frontiers. Again, a reference to Marcus Aurelius's time in battle on the frontiers defending Rome, and perhaps a sign that it's not as easy as it was for Trajan taking over Dacia, that it was a bit harder of a battle, a bit more graphic. We also see some similar kind of personifications like we see on the column of Trajan. So this is a storm god interrupting a battle in favor of the Romans. So it's almost like the Romans are not doing well, are maybe not fated to win, and so the gods have to intervene on their behalf, and a storm interrupts the battle so that it turns in the Romans' favor. So again, a reference to the hardship of this battle. It's not an easy win like maybe Dacia was, where we can just kind of celebrate and go home. It was a bit more difficult, and we actually see these kinds of bodies lying down here, almost stacked up. So really the hard parts of war depicted here. And then in this last one, just to give you a comparison, so this is a battle scene that we looked at between a Roman and a Dacian, and that's what I mean by that classical style, where it's kind of a pretty battle. They're kind of like, oh, I'm going to hit you, There's an element of almost slow movement here in the way that the arms are raised. And this person on the ground just kind of looks like they're sleeping. Like, yes, okay, they're dead, but like they just kind of look like they're asleep. And it's almost like a slow motion battle scene. Whereas here it's much more brutal. This person's arm is raised, and it's a little bit lower in the sense that it's about to come down on him. Whereas up here, it's kind of back more, like he's going to hit him. Here, it's like he's about to. He's much more closer to that graphic action. And this is actually a decapitation scene. So we see men who have already been killed here. For instance, this man's head is separated from his body, and you can see this one is too. And then we see these captives lined up, ready to be executed. So again, not as pretty of a war as the Dacian wars were on the column of Trajan. Again, just depicting the harder battle here, and perhaps that's why they're depicting scenes like this where they're much crueler to their enemies. So this art is depicting crueler scenes because they were maybe a little bit more emotional about it, a bit more upset that it was a difficult battle to win, and so they're not going to be as nice on their enemies afterward. So a bit of a difference that we see. That's going to do it for Marcus Aurelius. And that's going to do it for, as I said, the last of the 5 good emperors and the last of the Augustan peace, or the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, this period that was started under Augustus. We had the Augustan peace, and then that peace in a way continued up through Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is going to name his successor as his biological son. And that should tip you off right away that things are not going to go well. So he doesn't do merit-based succession. He doesn't pick someone who's almost, his own age or something that he thinks would be good for the job. He decides to pick his biological son, and that is Commodus. So Commodus reigns from 180 to 192, and he is a terrible ruler. So he is very similar to Nero or Domitian, hated by the Senate, known for being arrogant and cruel and lewd and just all of these terrible things. He was obsessed with Hercules, and he would always depict himself in the guise of Hercules. So we talked a little bit earlier about what those attributes are. The 2 main ones are the club and the lion skin from the Nemean lion. And so that's what we see. He's holding a club. This is Commodus, but he's holding a club and he's dressed in the lion skin. So he's depicting himself as Hercules. And as we've said, the cult of Hercules was growing at this time, so this might make sense, but Commodus kind of takes it to the next level, where he would not just depict himself like this in portraiture, he would actually dress up in real life like Hercules, and he would force people to watch him perform as Hercules. He would just, force people to watch him kind of act out scenes, I suppose. He also wanted to rename Rome after himself. So sorry, Romulus, you've had it for 800 years at this point, time to give someone else the city name. So Commodus wanted to name it after himself, which again, a very arrogant move, and a move that you can imagine many people in Rome would not like, considering the memory aspect to Roman culture, the fact that we so revere our history. We even have Roma, our personification of the city. The city of Rome is such a character and such a a member of the Roman national consciousness, that it's a big deal to rename Rome after yourself. So another reason Commodus was not liked. We also see just a few more things in this portrait. So we see that he is over top a world or a globe, which was sometimes associated with emperors, but we also see that like in the pedestal base of Antoninus Pius. We saw that it was a more divine figure holding the world, and here we see that it's an earthly figure holding the world. And then we also see some conquests, some conquered people underneath him. And that's right, and he also has apples in his hand, which is another symbol of Hercules. So if we look at one more work of art here, so these are 2 panels that we think are from the Arch of Marcus Aurelius, but the arch no longer exists, but these look like the types of panels that would exist on a triumphal arch. So that's kind of the theory. And if we look here, so Commodus reigns from 180, and so this is right before he takes over, right before Marcus Aurelius dies. And what we see here are 2 scenes, one of clemency on the left and one of triumph on the right. And in the scene of clemency, we have Marcus Aurelius on horseback, and we see people kneeling and he is pardoning them. So we've talked about this clemency scene where you give pardon to people. And so that's what we see in the left, this scene of clemency depicting Marcus Aurelius in a good light, right? The fact that he is kind of a merciful ruler, that he's granting pardon to these people. There are actually 2 German people kneeling before him, so presumably in the aftermath of his war against them, since we know that he actually fought up there. And we also see the kind of a scene being set with these trees and the other soldiers around them, that they're sort of marking the place where this is taking place. But on the right, we have a scene of triumph. And so we have, again, Marcus Aurelius in a chariot being pulled by 4 horses, a very common scene for the emperor. He is passing a temple in the background. And then if you look right here, he's actually about to go through a triumphal arch. So one of those meta scenes where we see a scene of triumph taking place on a triumphal arch and then referencing a triumphal arch on a triumphal arch. So we see that here. And the reason that this is kind of important is because it is another example of damnatio memoriae, in that Marcus Aurelius would have had his heir Commodus in the chariot with him, but he has since been hacked off. And so there's sort of this gap here where Commodus would have stood. But because the people hated Commodus so much, he was removed from this depiction after he was taken out of power, which is what happened. So in I believe 192, Commodus is assassinated, and that is going to spark a civil war, the likes of which Rome has not seen since the death of Nero and the beginning of the Flavian dynasty in 69. So quite a long period of 5, right? We had the Flavians and 5 good emperors, which were kind of a bit of a golden age, a bit of an Augustan time for Rome, where yes, they fought wars and they had some struggles, but overall quite good for them, a time of expansion and relative peace. And we're going to see that change, starting with Commodus, a very disliked emperor who is assassinated, and then that death sparks a civil war, again plunging Rome into some chaos, into not an episode of peace. So that's where we're going to leave it. We're going to pick up next time with the Civil War and with the dynasty that takes over, the Severan dynasty, and that will be Rome's last familial dynasty. So that will be the last set of rulers who are connected by family. So as you can see, as I've kind of alluded to, we are entering the last period of this course. We are entering the end of Rome's golden age, and we are starting to look at its decline a bit. And we're going to get into the end of Rome, the Roman Empire as we know it here, and into late antique art in the next 2 weeks. So we only have 2 weeks left, which is crazy. We have 9th week and 10th week. So we're going to be doing the Severans, and then that will lead us into kind of late antique Rome and the decline of the empire. So lots to look forward to. I don't know, but lots coming up, and thanks for sticking with me this long. So we've only got 2 weeks to go, so hang in there. We're almost there, and I'll see you next week.